For more than 40 years, Walter Dawson ate lunch the same way. A homemade sandwich, a paper cup of coffee, and a view of Main Street from the tailgate of his old pickup.
He never stepped inside the expensive steakhouse downtown. Not once. Not for birthdays, not for celebrations, not even when someone else offered to pay. He never stepped inside the expensive steakhouse downtown. Not once. Not for birthdays, not for celebrations, not even when someone else offered to pay. Most people assumed Walter simply hated spending money. And honestly, that explanation seemed good enough. What nobody realized was that Walter studied property values every single week. Every auction, every foreclosure, every commercial vacancy. Walter tracked them all. Meanwhile, the town's business district was quietly beginning to struggle. A few stores closed, then a few more. Most people believed the slowdown was temporary. Walter wasn't so sure. He had seen economic cycles before, and he knew what usually came next. Instead of worrying, Walter started preparing. Quietly, patiently, almost invisibly. Far away in New York, large investment firms were watching the same trends. But they were looking at numbers. Walter was looking at people. And that made all the difference.
Yeah, it's been a tough year for a lot of folks around here, but we'll get by. Always do.
Even the famous steakhouse downtown had started seeing empty tables. That had never happened before. The banker noticed it too. More businesses were struggling to make their payments. But Walter never panicked, because he had spent decades waiting for an opportunity most people feared. Walter knew downtown better than many real estate professionals. And nobody knew that. Then the downturn finally arrived, and Main Street changed almost overnight. The town saw empty buildings, the banks saw risk, the investors saw uncertainty. But Walter Dawson saw something completely different. Within months, foreclosure notices started appearing across town. Most people saw bad news. Walter saw information. Every evening he marked another property, another struggling business, another owner running out of options. The local bank was flooded with difficult conversations. Loans were becoming harder to maintain, and stress was spreading everywhere. One storefront became two became four, and soon entire sections of downtown looked different. Walter walked downtown almost every week, not to shop, to observe. He wasn't asking what the buildings were worth today. He was asking what they could become tomorrow. But Walter had spent decades preparing for moments exactly like this. The banker knew difficult months were ahead. He just didn't know how difficult. The first auction attracted very little interest. Almost nobody wanted commercial property anymore. Then Walter made a bid, a simple bid, on a building everyone else ignored. Walter didn't explain. He rarely explained anything. building became another folder, another long-term investment, another piece of a larger plan. And then another opportunity appeared. Then another. And another. Why are you buying these buildings, Walter? Walter gave the same answer he always gave.
I'm buying value while it's unpopular.
The banker remembered those words for years afterward, because at the time they sounded completely irrational. By the end of the year, Walter owned more downtown property than anyone realized. And he wasn't finished yet. Most people thought Walter was making a terrible mistake. The economy was still falling, businesses were still closing, but while everyone else was trying to survive the crisis. As the crisis deepened, Walter's collection of property files kept growing. Every folder represented a building someone else no longer wanted. He wasn't gambling. He wasn't guessing. He was following a plan that had taken decades to build. Downtown looked worse every month. The banker worried recovery might take years. Some business owners simply gave up. Others held on as long as they could.
It wasn't just a store. It was our life. My father's, mine, my son's. For a little while.
When he bought a property, he treated people fairly. That became part of his reputation. Rumors began spreading. Some people thought Walter had inherited money. Others believed he had secretly won the lottery. The funny part was, nothing about Walter's lifestyle changed. He still brought lunch from home, still drove the same truck, still wore the same jacket. Then something happened nobody expected. Investors in New York started noticing Walter's purchases. At first, they assumed the records were wrong. Farmers didn't normally buy downtown commercial real estate. The deeper they looked, the more unusual Walter's strategy appeared. Meanwhile, Walter kept buying carefully. Only properties he understood, only prices he considered reasonable. One day, the banker spread a map across his desk. Even he looked surprised. Walter now owned most of one side of Main Street, and neither of them had fully realized it. Years earlier, people laughed when he tracked property records. Now those records were turning into ownership. Eventually, one investor decided to see the situation personally. What he found surprised him. The properties weren't random. They connected together. Every building Walter bought strengthened the next purchase. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. The town still saw an old farmer who brought sandwiches from home, but investors were beginning to see something else. A man quietly assembling one of the most valuable positions in the county. By the third year of the downturn, Walter owned enough property that people started paying attention, not because he spoke about it, because the records spoke for him. The buildings weren't impressive yet. Many still sat empty, many still needed repairs. But Walter never cared about appearances.
And every calculation points toward the same conclusion. Walter controlled the most important properties in town. Separately, the buildings looked ordinary. Together, they formed something much more powerful.
The banker noticed something remarkable. The value of Walter's holdings was beginning to rise. Yet Walter spent his mornings fixing fences, exactly as he always had. People started asking questions. How much property did Walter actually own? Nobody seemed to know. Walter continued bringing sandwiches from home, even after becoming one of the largest property owners in town.
The numbers are clear. This is our opportunity to acquire the entire block. We need to move decisively.
One investor drove all the way from New York to make an offer. The offer would have changed most people's lives overnight. Walter barely looked at it. He studied every page. Not because he was tempted, because he respected details. After nearly an hour, Walter finally gave his answer.
No, thank you.
The investor thought Walter misunderstood the number. He hadn't. Walter wasn't looking at what the buildings were worth now. He was looking at what they could become later. Walter wasn't looking at what the buildings were worth now. He was looking at what they could become later.
When would you sell?
Walter smiled and gave the same answer he always gave. When the future finally arrives. The banker wasn't entirely sure what that meant. The town saw old buildings. The investors saw opportunity. But Walter Dawson saw something neither group fully understood. And within a few years passed. The panic faded. The headlines disappeared. And slowly, the town began finding its footing again. What had once been empty storefronts slowly came back to life. New businesses arrived. New families moved in. The recovery wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overnight. But it was real. The banker watched values climb year after year, and every report pointed back to one man. Walter still ate lunch from wax paper, still drank cheap coffee, still avoided expensive restaurants. When the investor returned years later, he barely recognized the town. The buildings he once considered risky now sat at the center of a thriving business district. This time, the investor wasn't there to convince Walter. He wanted to understand him. Walter's answer was surprisingly simple. He never bought buildings. He bought time. For a moment, the investor didn't respond, because suddenly everything made sense. Every purchase began years before the transaction, with research, observation, patience. The banker often joked that Walter had become the town's most successful developer. Walter always laughed at that. Because Walter never saw himself as a developer. He still saw himself as a farmer. What mattered most wasn't the value of the buildings. It was what happened inside them. The businesses returned, the jobs returned, and the town regained confidence. Ironically, the steakhouse was still there. Walter had never eaten inside. Not once. Some habits never changed, and Walter liked it that way. The city block many people abandoned during the crisis had become one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the county. And through it all, Walter Dawson remained exactly who he had always been. Most people thought Walter Dawson avoided fancy restaurants because he was poor. The truth was much simpler. He never cared about looking wealthy. While others spent money proving success,